The spotlight cut through the darkness of the grand ballroom, illuminating a single figure seated at a concert grand piano. Tommy Berkshire. 10 years old, his eyes unseeing behind dark glasses, sat perfectly still. His small hands rested on his lap, trembling slightly. 300 people filled the chairs behind him. Investors, business partners, society figures from across the city, all of them waiting, all of them watching this blind child who had no business being on that stage. Backstage, hidden in the shadows, Diane Williams pressed her back against the wall. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. She was just the housekeeper. She cleaned, she cooked, she stayed invisible. But Tommy's fingers were moving now, reaching for the keys. And Diane knew that in 60 seconds, everything would change. Everything they'd built in secret over the past 4 months would be exposed to the world. The question burning in everyone's mind was simple. How did a blind boy and his housekeeper end up here? The answer begins 6 months earlier in that same house, with that same piano, and a secret that could have destroyed them all. Diane Williams had cleaned the Berkshire mansion every weekday for 8 years. She arrived at 7 in the morning, let herself in through the kitchen door, and moved through the 23 rooms like a ghost. Efficient, quiet, professional. At 42, Diane had perfected the art of being present without being seen. It was a skill born from necessity, learned over years of working in homes where people had more money than they knew what to do with and more problems than money could solve. The Berkshire house sat on 3 acres in the wealthiest part of Portland, Oregon. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked manicured gardens. Marble floors reflected chandeliers that cost more than Diane made in a year. And in the corner of the main living room, positioned to catch the afternoon light, stood a Steinway grand piano worth $200,000. Diane dusted that piano every single day. She knew every curve of its polished surface, every reflection in its perfect black finish. But in 8 years, she had never heard a single note played on it. What the Berkshire family didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Diane understood that piano in ways they never would. Because 25 years ago, Diane had been someone else entirely. She'd been Diane Williams scholarship student at Roosevelt High School, first chair in the orchestra, the girl with hands that could make a piano sing. She'd been accepted to Berklee College of Music in Boston. Full scholarship. Her mother had cried. Her teachers had celebrated. The piano had been her ticket out her path to something more. Then her father had died. Suddenly, a heart attack at 51. And Diane's mother couldn't work anymore, couldn't pay the bills, couldn't keep the lights on. So Diane had set aside her acceptance letter, found work as a housekeeper, and learned to live with the sound of silence where music used to be. Now, every morning, when she dusted that Steinway, Diane let her fingers brush across the keys so softly they made no sound. It was the closest she came to playing, the closest she allowed herself to remember what she'd lost. She thought no one noticed these moments. She was wrong. Tommy Berkshire had been blind since birth. Retinopathy of prematurity, the doctors called it. Born 3 months early, his retinas never fully developed. By the time he was 6 months old, his parents knew he would never see the world the way they did. Most 10-year-olds filled their days with screens and sports and friends. Tommy filled his with sound. He could identify people by their footsteps. He knew his father's heavy, purposeful stride. He knew Mrs. Peterson next door by the clicking of her heels. And he knew Diane by the soft whisper of her movements, like she was trying not to disturb the air itself. Tommy spent most of his time alone in his room on the second floor. He had audiobooks and talking computers and all the adaptive technology money could buy. But what he loved most was listening to the sounds of the house. The creaking of floorboards, the humming of the refrigerator, the distant sound of Diane cleaning downstairs. And every day around 2 p.m, Tommy would hear something that made his heart race. It was so quiet, most people would miss it entirely. But Tommy's ears caught everything. It was the sound of fingers brushing piano keys, not playing, not pressing hard enough to make actual notes, just the whisper of skin against ivory, like someone saying hello to an old friend they weren't allowed to speak to anymore. Tommy had asked his father about piano lessons once when he was 7. He'd heard music on the radio and felt something wake up inside him, something urgent and necessary. But his father's face had gone cold and hard. No Richard Berkshire had said. Just that one word, flat and final. We don't play that piano. We don't touch that piano. End of discussion. Tommy had never asked again, but he'd never stopped listening. And he'd never stopped wondering what it would feel like to put his own hands on those keys to make sound, instead of just hearing it to create something beautiful in a world he couldn't see. 3 months ago, Tommy had started timing his trips downstairs. He'd wait until he heard Diane in the living room, then make his way down, one hand on the banister, counting steps the way he'd been taught. 32 steps from his room to the main floor, 15 more steps to the living room entrance, and there he would stand silent in the doorway, listening to Diane's secret goodbye to the piano each day. He never said anything. He just listened and wondered if she felt the same pull toward that instrument that he did. If she heard the same music hiding in the silence. Diane had noticed him there a week ago. She'd turned from the piano and found him standing motionless, his head tilted slightly, his face turned toward the sound she'd been making. "Tommy," she'd said softly, "how long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," he'd replied. "You love that piano, don't you?" Diane had frozen. Then quietly, "I used to play. A long time ago." "Why don't you play it now? Because it's not mine to play." Tommy had nodded, understanding immediately. "Because you're the housekeeper." "Because I'm the housekeeper," Diane had confirmed. They'd stood there in shared silence, two people hungry for something they couldn't have separated by age and race and circumstance, but united by the same impossible longing. That conversation had changed everything. Richard Berkshire built his fortune on reading people, knowing when to push and when to pull, when to trust and when to walk away. He'd turned a small property management company into a commercial real estate empire worth $300 million by the time he was 45. But he couldn't read his own son, couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap that seemed to grow wider every day. Couldn't find the words to explain why he spent 18 hours a day at the office instead of 18 hours at home. The truth was simpler and more painful than Richard wanted to admit. Every time he looked at Tommy, he saw Catherine, his wife, Tommy's mother, the woman who'd died 3 years ago when a drunk driver ran a red light and ended everything good in Richard's life. Catherine had been the music in their home. She'd played that Steinway every evening, filling the house with Chopin and Debussy, and her own improvisations that made Richard stop whatever he was doing and just listen. She'd been teaching Tommy to love music too before the accident, playing simple melodies for him, letting his small hands explore the keys. After she died, Richard couldn't bear to hear that piano, couldn't stand the reminder of what was gone. So he'd forbidden anyone to touch it, left it sitting there like a museum piece, beautiful and silent and utterly useless. He told himself he was protecting Tommy, that music would just remind the boy of what he'd lost, who he'd lost. Better to focus on practical things, education, technology, preparing Tommy for a world that wouldn't make allowances for his blindness. But late at night, when Richard couldn't sleep, he'd stand in the doorway of the living room and stare at that piano, and he'd know he was lying to himself. He wasn't protecting Tommy. He was protecting himself from the pain of remembering. Richard noticed Diane the way he noticed all his employees, as someone who did her job well and didn't cause problems. She'd been with the family since before Catherine died, and she'd stayed on, after which Richard appreciated. Consistency mattered when everything else fell apart. He had no idea that Diane watched him with quiet understanding, that she saw his grief written in every stiff shoulder and distant glance, that she recognized his avoidance because she understood what it meant to abandon music to survive. Richard Berkshire thought he had everything under control: his business, his home, his carefully structured life that left no room for unexpected emotions or unwanted memories. He had no idea that downstairs his housekeeper and his son were about to shatter that control completely. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Richard was in Seattle for a 3-day business conference. The house was quiet, except for the usual sounds: Diane moving through rooms, Tommy listening to an audiobook upstairs. Then Tommy's footsteps on the stairs. 32 steps down, 15 more to the living room. Diane looked up from polishing the coffee table to find him standing in the entrance, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression nervous. "Diane." His voice was small. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." Tommy took a breath. "Would you teach me to play piano?" Diane's hand stopped moving. The polishing cloth hung suspended in the air. "Tommy, you know your father doesn't want anyone touching that piano." "I know." Tommy's jaw set with determination that looked shockingly adult on his young face. "But he's not here, and you know how to play." "I heard you. I know you do." "Honey, I just dust it. I don't—" "You do more than dust it." Tommy took a step forward. "I hear you. Every day at 2 o'clock. Your fingers on the keys. You're not just cleaning. You're remembering." Diane felt something crack open in her chest. This child saw through her in ways adults never had. "Tommy, if your father found out I'd lose my job—" "He won't find out. He's never here anyway." There was no bitterness in Tommy's voice, just simple fact. "Please, Diane, I need this. I can't explain why, but I need it the same way you need to breathe. Haven't you ever felt that way about something?" "Yes," Diane wanted to say. "I felt that way about music for 18 years, until life taught me that needing something and having it are two different things." But looking at Tommy's face, at the desperate hope written there, she couldn't say any of that. Because this boy already knew too much about loss. He'd lost his sight before he ever had it. He'd lost his mother at 7 years old. And now he was asking for one thing, just one thing that might fill some of the emptiness. "If we did this," Diane said slowly, "it would have to be our secret. Completely. Your father can never know." Tommy's face transformed. "I can keep a secret. We'd only practice when he's gone. And we'd have to be ready to stop immediately if anything changes." "I understand." Diane looked at the piano. At this instrument that had been her first love, her greatest loss. At the promise of music that she'd buried 25 years ago. Maybe she thought maybe this wasn't just about Tommy. Maybe this was about giving both of them something they'd lost, a connection to who they used to be, who they might have been. "All right," Diane heard herself say. "Come here. Let me show you where middle C is." Tommy's smile could have lit up the whole house. He walked forward carefully, his hands outstretched. Diane guided him to the piano bench, helped him sit down, and then did something she hadn't done in 25 years. She lifted the fallboard that covered the keys. The piano exhaled as if it had been holding its breath all this time. That night, Diane lay awake in her small apartment across town, staring at the ceiling and wondering what she'd done. She'd crossed a line, violated her employer's explicit instruction, put her job at risk for a 10-year-old's wish. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Tommy's face when his fingers touched the keys for the first time. The wonder, the rightness. Like something in him had clicked into place. Diane had told him they'd just try one lesson, see how it went. But she'd known even as she said it that one lesson wouldn't be enough. Not for Tommy, not for her. Because the moment she'd sat beside him on that bench, the moment she'd guided his small hands to the proper position, something had woken up inside her that she thought was dead forever. The teacher in her, the musician. The person who understood that music wasn't just sound, it was language and emotion and truth. Tommy had natural talent. She'd seen it immediately. The way his fingers curved instinctively over the keys. The way he listened with absolute focus when she played a note and asked him to find it again. The way he smiled when he got it right. "Tell me what it sounds like," he'd said after she played middle C. "It sounds like the middle," Diane had replied. "Not high, not low, right in the center, like home." Tommy had played the note himself then, and his whole body had relaxed. "Yes," he'd said, "that's exactly what it sounds like home." They'd spent an hour together that first afternoon. Diane showed him how to find each key by feel, how to count the black keys to orient himself. She'd explained the pattern of the keyboard, how it repeated over and over the same shapes in different registers. Tommy had absorbed everything like he'd been starving for it. And maybe he had been. Maybe they both had. Now staring at her ceiling, Diane knew she was in too deep to back out. This wasn't just a favor to a lonely child anymore. This was something necessary. Something that might heal them both. She thought about Richard Berkshire, about his cold dismissal of music, his fortress of grief. She understood his pain, but she also knew that denying Tommy this gift wouldn't protect anyone. It would just create more emptiness in a house that already had too much. Tomorrow, Richard would be back from Seattle. The lessons would have to stop. But the day after he had meetings in San Francisco, 3 days away from home, 3 days when Diane and Tommy could steal back a little of what had been taken from them. She'd be careful. She'd be smart. And she'd give this child something beautiful in a world that had given him so much darkness. Diane closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, let herself imagine the sound of music filling a silent house. Richard left for San Francisco on Thursday morning. His car pulled out of the driveway at 6. By 7, Diane was at the house. By 9, she and Tommy were sitting side by side at the piano. Today, Diane said, "We're going to learn about chords." Do you know what a chord is? Multiple notes played at the same time, Tommy guessed. Exactly. Notes that blend together to create something bigger than any single note could be. Diane placed Tommy's right hand on the keys. Find middle C. Tommy's fingers moved confidently now, locating the note without hesitation. Good. Now, keeping your thumb on C, put your middle finger on E and your pinky on G. Tommy counted keys, positioned his fingers carefully. Like this, perfect. Now press all 3 notes at once. Tommy pressed down, and the C major chord rang out through the living room. His face went still with wonder. "That's beautiful," he whispered. "That's music," Diane said. "That's 3 notes that were made to go together. Now I want you to feel something. Listen to how that chord makes you feel." Tommy played the chord again, let it resonate. It feels happy, open, like sunshine. Diane felt her throat tighten. This child understood instinctively what some students never learned. Music wasn't about technique. It was about feeling. Now she said, "Let's learn a chord that feels different." She guided his hand to a minor. When Tommy played it, his expression changed. "This one's sad." "Not sad," Diane corrected gently. "Just more serious, more thoughtful. Music has all the same emotions people do. We just have to learn its language." For the next 2 hours, they explored. Diane taught Tommy the basic major and minor chords. She showed him how to move between them smoothly. She played simple progressions and asked him to describe what he heard. And Tommy soaked it all in, like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to teach him this language. His fingers found the keys with increasing confidence. His questions became more sophisticated. His understanding deepened with every passing minute. "Diane," he said during a break, "why did you stop playing? You're so good at this." Diane was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes life asks us to make choices, Tommy. My family needed me more than I needed music. Or at least that's what I told myself. Do you regret it?" "I used to. But right now, teaching you, I think maybe everything happened the way it was supposed to. Maybe I stopped playing so I could teach you instead." Tommy turned his face toward her voice. "You really think that I'm starting to?" Diane said. And she realized she meant it. By the time they finished for the day, Tommy could play a simple chord progression. C major to G major to A minor to F major. 4 chords that could form the foundation of 1,000 songs. "Tomorrow," Diane said, "we'll learn a melody to go with those chords. Something simple and beautiful." What song? Diane thought for a moment. Then she remembered a lullaby Catherine used to hum around the house. Something gentle and hopeful. "Let me surprise you." That night, Diane went home and wrote out the melody in Braille music notation. It took her 3 hours translating the notes into the raised dots Tommy could read with his fingers. But when she finally finished, she sat back and looked at what she'd created. She was teaching a blind child to play piano using a system she'd had to research and learn from scratch. She was risking her job, her security, her carefully ordered life. And she'd never felt more alive. Over the next 4 weeks, something extraordinary happened in the Berkshire house. Every day that Richard was gone, Diane and Tommy claimed the living room as their own. The piano that had been silent for 3 years began to wake up. Tommy learned with a speed that astonished Diane. His blindness, rather than being an obstacle, became an asset. Without sight to distract him, he listened with absolute focus. He felt every vibration of the strings, every resonance in the wood. He understood rhythm by the beating of his own heart. Diane taught him proper hand position, finger strength, the importance of relaxed wrists. But more importantly, she taught him to feel the music, to understand that every note had emotion. Every chord had meaning. "Music is telling a story," she'd say. "Your job is to figure out what that story is and help other people hear it." Tommy would nod his fingers, moving over the keys, searching for the story hidden in the notes. By the end of the first week, he could play "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" with both hands. Simple, but clean. By the end of the second week, he'd mastered a simplified version of Für Elise. The third week brought their first real scare. Richard's meeting in Chicago ended early. Diane got the text at 1:30 in the afternoon coming home. ETA 4 p.m. Tommy was in the middle of practicing scales. Diane's heart jumped into her throat. "Stop," she said quietly. "Your father's coming home early. We have to clean up." Tommy's hands froze on the keys. "How much time?" 2.5 hours. They moved with practiced efficiency now. Tommy returned to his room. Diane wiped down the piano keys, removed any trace of their presence, closed the fallboard. By the time Richard's car pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it always did. Perfect. Untouched. Silent. Richard came through the door with his briefcase and his distracted expression. "Diane, everything all right here?" "Yes, Mr. Berkshire. Everything's fine." He nodded, already moving toward his office, his mind clearly on work. He didn't notice the slight warmth of the piano keys, didn't hear the lingering vibration of music in the air. Tommy, upstairs in his room, sat on his bed with his hands pressed together, his heart pounding. That had been too close. But the next morning, Richard left for New York, 4 days away. And that afternoon, Tommy's fingers found the keys again, and the house breathed music once more. By the end of the fourth week, something had shifted in Tommy. He carried himself differently, moved with more confidence. The isolation that had defined him was starting to crack. And Diane noticed that when Tommy played, she could hear Catherine in the music. Not that Tommy sounded like Catherine, but he had the same gift she'd had the ability to make a piano sing, to find the emotional truth in every phrase. One afternoon, Diane made a decision. "Tommy, I think you're ready for something more challenging." "What?" "Chopin. Prelude in E minor. It's sad and beautiful, and I think you'll love it." She played the opening measures for him. The haunting melody filled the room, melancholy and searching. When she finished, Tommy was silent. Then, "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." "Yes, I want to learn it. It's difficult. I don't care." So Diane taught him, measure by measure, phrase by phrase. Tommy struggled with the fingering, with the emotion, with the weight of sadness the piece carried. But he didn't give up. 2 weeks later, on a gray afternoon when rain streaked the windows, Tommy played the Chopin Prelude from beginning to end. Not perfectly, but with such raw emotion that Diane had to turn away to hide her tears. When he finished, Tommy sat perfectly still. "I felt her," he said quietly. "What?" "My mom. When I was playing, I felt like she was here." Diane's breath caught. "Your mother loved Chopin." "I know. Dad used to play her recordings sometimes before he stopped letting himself remember." Tommy's voice was matter-of-fact, but his hands trembled slightly on the keys. "When I play this music, I understand her a little better." "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Diane whispered. That night, Diane realized something important. This wasn't just about teaching Tommy to play piano anymore. This was about giving him a connection to the mother he'd lost, the father who'd disappeared into grief, and the parts of himself he didn't know existed yet. Music was becoming Tommy's way of seeing the world, and Diane was honored to be his guide. The second month brought rapid progress and increasing risk. Tommy practiced every chance he got. He'd memorized 20 pieces now, his fingers moving with confidence across the keyboard. His understanding of music theory had grown sophisticated. He could analyze chord progressions, identify key changes, discuss dynamics and phrasing. But more importantly, Tommy was changing. The quiet, withdrawn boy was opening up. He smiled more. He asked questions about everything. And for the first time in 3 years, he seemed genuinely happy. Diane saw the change and felt both joy and terror. Because the more Tommy invested in music, the more devastating it would be when Richard found out. And Richard would find out. Secrets like this never stayed hidden forever. They developed a system. When Richard was home, Tommy would text Diane using a special code. Can you pick up eggs meant Richard was in his office, and they had maybe 30 minutes. The washing machine is acting up meant abort everything immediately. They had close calls that made Diane's blood run cold. Richard coming home unexpectedly, the cleaning service arriving on the wrong day, a neighbor stopping by unannounced. Each time they managed to hide the evidence, but each time Diane felt the noose tightening. The worst moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Tommy was practicing Debussy's Clair de Lune, one of the most technically challenging pieces Diane had taught him. His fingers moved through the cascading notes, his expression peaceful and focused. Then they heard it. The garage door opening. Richard's car. He wasn't supposed to be home for 3 more hours. Stop, Diane hissed. Tommy's hands flew off the keys. They had maybe 90 seconds. Go, Diane said. Back door. To your room. Fast. Tommy moved his spatial memory, guiding him through the house at a near run. Diane wiped the keys closed. The fallboard grabbed her cleaning supplies. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the spray bottle. Richard's footsteps in the mudroom. The door opening. Diane. In here, Mr. Berkshire. Her voice sounded almost normal. Almost. Richard appeared in the living room doorway, his expression distracted. I forgot some files. Have you seen my brown folder? I think it's in your office, sir. On the desk. He nodded, already turning away. Then he stopped. Paused. Turned back. Diane's heart stopped beating. Richard looked at the piano, at the fallboard that was still slightly warm from Tommy's hands, at the bench that hadn't quite been pushed back into its exact position. Time stretched like taffy. Diane couldn't breathe. Then Richard's phone rang. He glanced at it, sighed. I have to take this. He walked toward his office without another word. Diane sagged against the wall, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. That had been too close, way too close. Upstairs, Tommy sat on his bed, his whole body shaking. He'd heard every word through the air vent. He knew how close they'd come to disaster. That evening, Diane considered ending the lessons. The risk was too high, the consequences too severe. But when she went to Tommy's room to tell him they needed to stop, she found him sitting at his Braille keyboard, translating a new piece of music into notation he could read. His face was lit with concentration and joy. Diane, he said when he sensed her presence. I've been thinking, I want to learn Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The whole thing, not just the first movement. Can you teach me? Diane looked at this child, who'd found purpose and happiness in music, who practiced until his fingers ached, who dreamed in melodies now instead of silence. Yes, she heard herself say, I can teach you. They'd be more careful, they'd take fewer risks. But she couldn't take this away from him, not when it had given him so much, even if it meant gambling with everything she had. November brought rain and shorter days. It also brought a shift in the lessons. Tommy had mastered the technical aspects quickly. Now Diane focused on interpretation, on the art of performance. Music isn't just about playing the right notes, she told him. It's about making choices. When do you get louder? When do you pull back? Where do you breathe? Tommy absorbed these lessons with the same intensity he brought to everything else. His playing developed nuance, emotion. He wasn't just playing music anymore. He was becoming a musician. One rainy afternoon, as Tommy worked through a particularly difficult passage in the Moonlight Sonata, he stopped abruptly. Diane, why did you really stop playing piano? Diane had been dreading this question. I told you, my family needed me. But that's not the whole story, is it? This child was too perceptive. Diane sighed. No, it's not. Will you tell me? Diane sat down on the bench beside him. I was 18. I had a full scholarship to Berklee College of Music, best music school in the country. I was going to be a concert pianist. That was the dream. What happened? My father died. Heart attack. And my mother couldn't manage alone. She had health issues, bills we couldn't pay. I was the oldest. It was my responsibility. Tommy was quiet, processing. So you gave up your dream. I chose my family over my dream. That's different. Is it? Tommy turned his face toward her. Because it sounds like you lost both. Your father died anyway, and you never got your music back. The observation hit Diane like a physical blow. This 10-year-old had just articulated something she'd never let herself fully acknowledge. She'd sacrificed her dream, but it hadn't saved anyone. Her father was still gone. Her mother had died 5 years later. And Diane had spent 25 years cleaning other people's houses, her talent gathering dust. You're right, she said quietly. I lost both. I'm sorry. Don't be. Because if I hadn't made that choice, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be teaching you. And Tommy teaching you has given me something I thought was gone forever. What purpose? Joy. A reason to make music again, even if it's through your hands instead of mine. Tommy reached out, found Diane's hand, squeezed it. Thank you for giving up your dream so you could help me find mine. Diane felt tears slide down her cheeks. You're welcome, sweetheart. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Tommy said, Can I ask you something else? Anything? Why doesn't my dad want me to play? Is it really just about Mom? Diane chose her words carefully. Your father loved your mother more than anything, and she loved this piano. When she died, I think the music hurt too much. It reminded him of everything he lost. But doesn't he see that I lost her too? That maybe music could help me remember her instead of forget her? I don't think he can see that right now, Tommy. Grief makes people do things that don't make sense. Will he ever see it? I don't know, Diane admitted. I hope so. Tommy nodded slowly. Then he turned back to the piano, his hands finding the keys. Can I play you something? Of course. Tommy began to play. Not one of the pieces Diane had taught him, but something new. An improvisation. His fingers moved across the keys, creating a melody that was sad and hopeful at the same time. It spoke of loss and love, of darkness, and the small lights that guide us through. Diane recognized what was happening. Tommy wasn't just playing notes anymore. He was composing, creating his own music, his own voice. When he finished, Diane was crying openly. Tommy, that was beautiful. Did you just make that up? Yes. I've been hearing it in my head for weeks. I wanted to wait until I was good enough to play it. What do you call it? Tommy thought for a moment. For Mom. For the mother I can't see, but can feel in the music. Diane pulled Tommy into a hug, this incredible child, who'd taught her as much as she'd taught him. who'd reminded her why music mattered, why beauty mattered, why taking risks was sometimes the only way to truly live. "You're not just learning piano, Tommy," she whispered. "You're becoming an artist." And in that moment, Diane knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next, whatever consequences came from their secret, it would be worth it. Because she'd helped this child find his voice. And maybe in the process, she'd found hers again, too. By December, Tommy could play pieces that would challenge many adult pianists. The Moonlight Sonata, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Bach's Prelude in C. His repertoire had grown to 35 pieces, all memorized, all performed with technical precision and emotional depth. But more impressive than his technical skill was his musicality. Tommy had developed an instinct for phrasing, for dynamics, for the subtle choices that separated good playing from great playing. He understood that music was a conversation between the performer and the audience, and he'd learned to speak that language fluently. Diane found herself learning from him now as much as teaching. Tommy's interpretations were fresh, unencumbered by traditional approaches. He played what he felt, not what he thought he should feel. It made his performances honest in a way that took most musicians decades to achieve. "You have a gift," Diane told him one afternoon. "A real, genuine gift. The kind that comes along maybe once in a generation." Tommy ducked his head, embarrassed. "I just play what I hear. That's what makes you special. Most people have to work for years to connect what they hear with what they play. You do it naturally." They were sitting at the piano taking a break between pieces. Outside, snow fell softly, turning the world white and quiet. "Diane," Tommy said, "what do you think happens after this?" "After what? After I learn all the pieces you can teach me? After I get as good as I can get with secret lessons?" What then? Diane had been avoiding this question for weeks. Because she knew the answer, and it terrified her. "I don't know, Tommy." "Yes, you do." Tommy's voice was gentle but insistent. "You know I need more than you can give me. I need a real teacher, a conservatory, other musicians to play with. Your father can't keep me from music forever. It's part of who I am now. Just like being blind is part of who I am. He'll have to accept it eventually. And if he doesn't?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Then I'll have to choose. And I'll choose music, even if it costs me everything." The conviction in his voice shook Diane to her core. This wasn't a child speaking anymore. This was a young man who'd found his purpose and wouldn't be denied. "Let's not think about that now," Diane said, though she knew they'd have to face it soon. "Let's just focus on making you the best pianist you can be." They had 2 more close calls that month. The first came when Mrs. Peterson from next door stopped by, unexpectedly claiming she'd heard piano music. Richard was home, thank God, and dismissed it as the radio. But Diane and Tommy had to be even more careful about volume after that. The second scare was worse. Richard's assistant called Diane one morning asking if she'd seen a particular document. Richard needed it for a meeting, but it was nowhere in his office. "I'll look around," Diane had said. She found it 20 minutes later on the piano bench where Tommy must have set it while moving his Braille sheet music. Her blood ran cold. If Richard had found it there himself, if he'd wondered why anything would be on that bench. Diane showed the document to Tommy, later her hands shaking. "We have to be more careful. One mistake, Tommy. That's all it takes." But even as she said it, she knew they were running out of time. The secret was getting harder to keep. The risks were multiplying, and Tommy's talent was growing too big to hide in stolen afternoons and secret sessions. Something would have to give. Soon. On Christmas Eve, Richard hosted a small dinner party, business associates and their families. Diane served food and stayed invisible the way she always did. But at one point she found herself standing near the piano as guests mingled. A woman in an expensive dress gestured toward the Steinway. "Richard, I'd forgotten what a beautiful instrument this is." "Do you ever play?" "No," Richard said shortly. "Not anymore? What a shame. A piano like this deserves to be played." Richard's expression went cold. "Some things are better left alone." The woman, sensing she'd touched a nerve, changed the subject quickly, but Diane caught the look on Tommy's face. He was upstairs listening through the air vent like he always did during parties, and the pain in his expression was unmistakable. His father stood 20 feet from the piano Tommy poured his soul into every day, and Richard couldn't even acknowledge its existence without shutting down. Later that night, after the party ended and everyone had gone home, Diane found Tommy in his room. "He'll never understand," Tommy said quietly. "Will he?" Diane wanted to lie to offer false comfort, but she couldn't. "I don't know, sweetheart. Your father's grief runs very deep, deeper than his love for me." The question broke Diane's heart. "No, never that. He just doesn't know how to show it anymore." Tommy nodded, but Diane could see he didn't believe her. And who could blame him? Richard worked 18-hour days, came home to eat and sleep, and barely spoke to his son. Music was the only language Tommy had to express what he felt, and Richard had forbidden him from speaking it. Something would have to break, and soon. Diane just hoped they'd all survive the breaking. It happened on a Tuesday in January. Richard's meeting in Boston had been canceled at the last minute due to weather. His flight was redirected back to Portland. He arrived home at 2 p.m, 5 hours earlier than planned. He didn't text Diane, didn't call ahead. Just pulled into the garage and let himself in through the mudroom. The first thing he heard was music. Not the radio, not a recording. Live music coming from the living room. Piano music. The Moonlight Sonata played with skill and emotion that stopped Richard in his tracks. For a moment he stood frozen in the mudroom, his briefcase still in his hand. Because the music was beautiful, heartbreaking, exactly the way Catherine used to play it. Then reality crashed in. Someone was playing Catherine's piano, the piano he'd forbidden anyone to touch. Richard's shock turned to anger. He strode through the house, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. The music continued, the player clearly unaware of his presence. He reached the living room doorway and stopped. Tommy sat at the piano, his hands moving across the keys with practiced confidence. His eyes were closed behind his dark glasses, his face peaceful and focused. And standing behind him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, was Diane. Richard's world tilted sideways. This couldn't be real. His son couldn't play piano. Diane couldn't have betrayed his trust this completely, but the evidence was right in front of him, undeniable and devastating. Tommy finished the phrase he was playing, and Diane spoke softly. "Beautiful, Tommy. Now let's try that passage again with a little more rubato in the..." She looked up and saw Richard. The color drained from her face. "Mr. Berkshire," she whispered. "You're home early." Tommy's hands froze on the keys. His head turned toward his father's presence, his expression morphing from peaceful to terrified in the space of a heartbeat. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard stood perfectly still, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. His son, who he'd forbidden from touching this piano playing Beethoven like he'd been training for years. His housekeeper, who he'd trusted implicitly teaching him in direct violation of explicit orders. How long Richard's voice came out strangled. How long has this been going on? Diane's throat worked. Mr. Berkshire, I can explain how. Long. 4 months, she said quietly. 4 months. 4 months of deception. 4 months of his son and his employee going behind his back. 4 months of lies. Richard's anger crystallized into something cold and sharp. Tommy, go to your room. Dad. Tommy's voice was small. Now. Tommy stood on shaking legs, walked past his father without a word, his head down. Richard heard him climbing the stairs, heard his bedroom door close. Then Richard turned to Diane. You're fired. Get your things and leave. Now. Diane had known this moment would come eventually, but knowing didn't make it easier. Mr. Berkshire, please listen, I don't want to hear it. Richard's voice was ice. I gave you one rule. One, don't touch that piano. And you ignored me completely. Tommy is my son, not yours. You don't get to decide what he needs. Diane felt her own anger rising to meet his. Maybe not. But somebody had to pay attention to him. Somebody had to see that he was drowning in loneliness. That's not your concern. Yes, it is. Diane's voice rose. I've worked in this house for 8 years. I've watched you bury yourself in work while your son grew up alone. I've seen him sitting by himself listening to the world hungry for connection. And when he asked me to teach him the one thing that brought him joy, I couldn't say no. You should have. You should have respected my wishes and my authority in my own home. Your wishes were wrong. The words burst out of Diane before she could stop them. That piano has sat silent for 3 years because you can't face your grief. But Tommy lost his mother too. And instead of helping him process that loss, you've hidden from it. You've hidden from him. Richard's face went pale with rage. You have no right, I have every right. I've spent 4 months watching your son come alive through music, watching him find purpose and confidence and joy. He's a gifted pianist, Mr. Berkshire. Genuinely gifted. And you were going to let that talent die because it reminded you of your wife. Get out. Richard's voice was deadly quiet now. Get out of my house and don't come back. Fine. Diane grabbed her purse from the table. But you should know something. Tommy composed a piece of music. He called it For Mom. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. And you'll never hear it because you're too busy running from your pain to see what's right in front of you. She walked toward the door, then stopped. Turned back. He loves you, you know, despite everything. He still loves you. I hope someday you'll find a way to let him know you love him too. Then Diane walked out of the Berkshire house for the last time, her heart breaking for the child she was leaving behind. Richard stood alone in the living room, his chest heaving with emotion. The house was quiet, except for the sound of his own breathing. He looked at the piano, at the bench where Tommy had been sitting, at the sheet music written in Braille that Diane must have prepared. His son could play piano. His blind 10-year-old son could play Beethoven. Richard sank onto the couch, his anger draining away, leaving only confusion and pain. Upstairs, Tommy sat on his bed, tears streaming down his face. He'd heard everything, every word of the confrontation. And now Diane was gone, and his father was angry, and the music that had saved him was forbidden again. He thought about the pieces he'd learned, the hours at the piano, the connection to his mother he'd found in the melodies. All of it was over now. Tommy's hands shook. He pressed them together, trying to stop the trembling, but he could still feel the keys under his fingers, could still hear the music in his head. Diane's voice echoed in his memory. Music isn't about permission, Tommy. It's about truth. And your truth is that you're a musician. Nobody can take that from you. But his father just had. Downstairs, Richard walked to the piano. He lifted the fallboard, revealing the keys for the first time in 3 years. His hands hovered over them, but he couldn't bring himself to touch them. Catherine used to sit here every evening, used to fill this house with Chopin and Debussy and Beethoven, used to smile at Richard over her shoulder as she played, her face lit with joy. Richard had loved watching her play, loved the way music transformed her into something more than human, something pure and beautiful. After she died, he couldn't bear the silence that replaced her music, so he'd forbidden anyone to play, thinking that would make it easier, that removing the possibility of music would remove the pain of missing it. But he'd been wrong. The silence had been worse than any music could have been. And now, finding out that his son had been filling that silence without him knowing, Richard felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. He thought about Diane's words. He's gifted. Genuinely gifted. Could that be true? Could Tommy really have talent? Or was Diane just being kind to a blind child who'd begged for lessons? Richard's phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. Meeting with the Seattle investors moved to tomorrow. Do you need me to book a flight? Richard stared at the message. A week ago, he would have said yes immediately, would have thrown himself into work, into deals and negotiations, and the safe, predictable world of business. But right now, standing in this living room with his son crying upstairs, and his housekeeper's words ringing in his ears, Richard couldn't make himself care about the Seattle investors. He walked upstairs slowly, stood outside Tommy's door, his hand raised to knock. He could hear Tommy crying quietly inside. Richard had no idea what to say, no idea how to fix this, no idea how to be the father Tommy needed. So he did what he always did. He walked to his own room, closed the door, and told himself everything would be clearer in the morning. But that night, lying in bed, Richard couldn't sleep, because he kept hearing music in his head. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, played with skill and emotion that shouldn't have been possible, played by his son, who he barely knew anymore. Richard didn't go to Seattle the next day. He called his assistant, canceled the meeting, and spent the morning sitting in his office, staring at nothing. Around noon, he found himself walking through the house, looking at it the way a stranger might, seeing the emptiness that had become normal. 23 rooms, and only 2 of them showed signs of life. His office cluttered with work. Tommy's room filled with audiobooks and adaptive technology. The rest of the house was a museum, beautiful and cold and utterly sterile. When had this happened? When had his home become a mausoleum? Richard knew the answer. 3 years ago, the day Catherine died. He'd thought that by freezing everything, by keeping the house exactly as it had been, he could preserve something of her. But all he'd done was create a shrine to absence, a monument to what was missing. And in that frozen house, Tommy had grown up alone. Richard thought about his son, really thought about him for the first time in years. What did Tommy do all day? Who were his friends? What made him happy? Richard realized with shame that he didn't know the answers to any of these questions. He'd been so focused on managing his own grief that he'd forgotten Tommy was grieving too. That Tommy had lost his mother at 7 years old, lost his sight before he could even form memories of color, and had been navigating the world alone while Richard hid in his office. What kind of father did that make him? Richard walked to the piano. He opened the fallboard again, looked at the keys. Catherine's hands had touched these keys. And now Tommy's had too. Richard pulled out his phone, searched for blind pianist. The results flooded in. Ray Charles, Stevie Wonder, Nobuyuki Tsuji, George Shearing. Dozens of successful, accomplished musicians who'd overcome blindness to create beauty. Why had Richard assumed Tommy couldn't do the same? Because it was easier, he realized. Easier to say no than to say yes. Easier to forbid than to facilitate. Easier to keep everything frozen than to risk the pain of growth and change. Richard found a video of Nobuyuki Tsuji playing the Moonlight Sonata. He watched the young Japanese pianist's hands move across the keys with the same confidence he'd seen in Tommy. Watched the expression on Tsuji's face, peaceful, focused, transported by the music. He'd seen that same expression on Tommy's face yesterday. Richard sat at the piano bench, put his hands on the keys the way Catherine had taught him years ago when they were young and newly married, and she'd insisted he learn at least one song. He played it now. Chopsticks. Simple and childish and completely inadequate. But it was all he remembered. The sound filled the living room, awkward and halting. And Richard realized something. This piano hadn't been played in 3 years until Tommy touched it, which meant Tommy's hands had broken the silence Richard had imposed. Tommy had been brave enough to reach for something beautiful even when it was forbidden, while Richard had been too afraid to try. Richard climbed the stairs to Tommy's room, knocked softly on the door. "Go away." Tommy's voice was thick with tears. "Tommy, I need to talk to you. I don't want to talk to you." Richard felt the rejection like a physical blow, but he deserved it. "Please, son. 5 minutes." Silence. Then fine. Richard opened the door. Tommy sat on his bed, his face turned toward the window, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Richard sat down in the desk chair. "I owe you an apology." Tommy said nothing. "I was wrong," Richard continued. "About the piano. About forbidding you from playing. About everything. You fired Diane." Tommy's voice was flat. "Yes, I did. She was just trying to help me." "I know. She gave me something I needed. Something you wouldn't give me. Each word was an accusation, each one true." "You're right," Richard said quietly. "I failed you. I was so wrapped up in my own grief that I couldn't see yours. I thought keeping you away from the piano would protect you from pain, but all I did was take away something that could have helped you heal." Tommy's jaw clenched. "You still don't get it. Then help me understand." Tommy turned to face his father for the first time. Tears streaked his face. "Music isn't about Mom. I mean, yes, it connects me to her, but that's not why I needed it. I needed it because it's the only way I can see the world. What I'm blind, Dad. I'll always be blind. I can't see colors or faces or sunsets, but when I play piano, I can see everything. I can see emotions and stories and beauty. Music is how I make sense of a world I can't see with my eyes. And you tried to take that away from me." Richard felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "Tommy, I didn't understand, no. You didn't. Because you never asked. You just decided what was best for me without ever talking to me about it." Tommy's voice cracked. "Do you have any idea how lonely I've been? How much I needed something, anything to make me feel like I mattered? You matter. You've always mattered. Then why do you spend 18 hours a day at work? Why do you barely talk to me? Why does it feel like you can't stand to be in the same room as me?" Richard's throat closed up. "Because you remind me of her. Every time I look at you, I see Catherine. And it hurts so much I can barely breathe." Tommy was silent for a long moment. Then quietly, "I look like her. You have her smile, her way of tilting your head when you're thinking, her kindness." Richard's voice broke. "She would have been so proud of you. She would have let me play piano." Yes, she would have. And I should have too. Tommy wiped his face with his sleeve. I'm good, Dad. Really good. Diane said I have a gift. I heard you yesterday, before everything fell apart. You were playing the Moonlight Sonata. Did you like it? Richard thought about lying, about softening the truth. But Tommy deserved honesty. It was the most beautiful thing I've heard since your mother died. Tommy's expression shifted. Hope flickered across his face. Really, really. Richard stood up, moved to sit beside Tommy on the bed. I want to hear you play again, if you'll let me. What about Diane? Richard had been expecting this. I'll call her. Apologize. Ask her to come back if she's willing. You fired her. She might not want to come back, I know, but I have to try. Richard put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. You deserve a real teacher, Tommy. Someone who can take you further than secret lessons in stolen afternoons. If music is your gift, then we should nurture it, the way your mother would have wanted. Tommy turned his face toward Richard. You mean it? I mean it. For the first time in 3 years, Tommy hugged his father, and Richard held on tight, feeling the boy not quite a boy anymore, shake with sobs against his chest. I'm sorry, Richard whispered. I'm so sorry I made you feel like you didn't matter. You matter more than anything in this world. They sat there for a long time, father and son beginning the long process of finding their way back to each other. Finally, Tommy pulled back. Will you really call Diane? Right now? Richard promised. Richard called Diane that afternoon. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Diane, this is Richard Berkshire. I need to apologize for everything I said yesterday, for firing you, for not seeing what you were doing for Tommy. You were right. About all of it. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. I'd like to make this right. She didn't call back that day, or the next. On the third day, Richard's phone rang. Diane's number. Mr. Berkshire. Her voice was wary. Thank you for calling back. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. I don't blame you. But Diane, I need you to know how sorry I am. You saw what Tommy needed when I was too blind to see it myself. You gave him a gift I was too afraid to give him. And instead of thanking you, I fired you. I was wrong. Silence on the line. Then, how is Tommy heartbroken? He misses you. I miss him too. Richard took a breath. Diane, I want to do something. Something that will show Tommy that music matters, that he matters, and I need your help. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about a recital. Here at the house. I'll invite people, business associates, neighbors, friends. And Tommy will perform, a real performance with a real audience. Will you help me prepare him? Another long silence. Mr. Berkshire, are you sure about this? A public performance is a lot of pressure. Tommy is ready for pressure. He's been ready. I just couldn't see it. This isn't just about apologizing to me, is it? No. It's about apologizing to Tommy. About showing him that I see him now. That I'm proud of him. Diane was quiet for so long Richard thought she might have hung up. Then, all right, I'll help you. But on one condition, anything. After this, you get Tommy a real teacher. Someone who can take him to the next level. I've taught him everything I can, but he needs more. Already planned, Richard said. I've been researching music programs for blind students. There's a teacher in Seattle who specializes in working with visually impaired pianists. If Tommy wants it, we'll make it happen. He'll want it. Then, it's settled. They spent the next hour planning. The recital would be in 2 weeks, enough time for Tommy to prepare, but not so long that he'd psych himself out. Diane would come to the house every day to coach him. Richard would handle invitations and logistics. When Richard hung up, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. He went upstairs to Tommy's room. She said yes. Tommy's face lit up. Really? Really? She'll be here tomorrow to start preparing you for the recital. Dad. I'm scared. I know. But Diane will be with you, and I'll be with you. You're not doing this alone. Tommy nodded, his hands trembling slightly. What should I play? Richard thought about Catherine, about the music she loved, about the piece Tommy had been playing when Richard discovered the secret. The Moonlight Sonata, Richard said. Play the piece you were playing when I came home. The one that reminded me why music matters. The whole thing. All three movements. All three movements. Tommy's expression shifted from scared to determined. Okay, I can do that. I know you can. 2 weeks later, the Berkshire living room was transformed. Chairs had been arranged in rows facing the piano. Flowers decorated every surface. Soft lighting created an intimate atmosphere. 75 people filled those chairs. Business associates Richard had worked with for years, neighbors from down the street, Tommy's teachers from school, even a reporter from the local paper invited by Richard to document this moment. And backstage, really just the hallway leading to the living room, Tommy stood in his best suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his whole body trembling. Diane knelt beside him. Remember what we practiced. Deep breaths. Feel the keys before you start. And most importantly, play from your heart. Everyone out there wants you to succeed. What if I mess up? Then you keep playing. Music isn't about perfection, Tommy. It's about truth. And your truth is beautiful. Richard appeared in the hallway. He looked at his son, this brave child, who was about to share his gift with the world, and felt his chest tighten with pride. Ready? He asked gently. Tommy nodded. Will you walk me out? Richard's throat closed up. Of course. They walked together into the living room. The crowd fell silent. Richard guided Tommy to the piano bench, helped him sit down. Then Richard spoke to the assembled guests. Thank you all for coming. A few months ago, my son discovered something I'd tried to keep hidden. Music. And in discovering it, he discovered part of himself. Tonight, Tommy is going to share that discovery with you. Please welcome my son, Tommy Berkshire. Applause filled the room. Richard took his seat in the front row, next to where Diane was standing. Tommy sat perfectly still at the piano, his hands resting on his lap. The room was so quiet, you could hear people breathing. Then Tommy reached forward. His fingers found the keys, exploring the familiar landscape. He took a breath, and he began to play. The first movement of the Moonlight Sonata emerged from the piano like a meditation. Slow, contemplative haunting. Tommy's hands moved with absolute confidence, finding each note with precision. But more than the technical accuracy, it was the emotion that stopped people's breath. This wasn't a child playing piano. This was an artist sharing his soul. The first movement gave way to the second, faster and more playful. Tommy's face transformed as he played the concentration, giving way to something like joy. His fingers danced across the keys, navigating the complex passages with ease. Then came the third movement, the famous presto agitato. Fast, furious, technically demanding. Tommy's hands flew across the keyboard, his whole body engaged in the music. The notes cascaded like water, like thunder, like every emotion compressed into sound. In the audience, people sat frozen. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Others simply stared, unable to believe what they were hearing. Richard watched his son and saw Catherine in every movement, saw her passion, her gift, her ability to make music transcendent. But he also saw Tommy, his brave, talented, extraordinary son who'd found a way to see the world through sound. The final notes rang out. Tommy's hands hovered over the keys for a moment, then slowly lowered to his lap. Silence. Complete, utter silence. Then someone stood up. Then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, applauding with a fervor that shook the chandelier. Tommy sat perfectly still, his face a mixture of shock and overwhelming emotion. He hadn't expected this, couldn't process it. Diane was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth. Richard stood, walked to the piano, pulled Tommy into a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered into Tommy's ear. "Your mother would be so proud." Tommy clung to his father, his thin shoulders shaking. "Did I do okay? You did more than okay. You were magnificent." The applause continued, and continued. People shouted, "Bravo!" Someone threw flowers toward the piano. When the crowd finally quieted enough for people to speak, they swarmed forward. Compliments poured in from every direction. "That was extraordinary. I had no idea. Where did you learn to play like that?" Tommy handled it with grace, thanking everyone, but his attention kept returning to two people. His father standing beside him with a hand on his shoulder, and Diane watching from a few feet away with pride written across her face. Finally, when the crowd began to thin, Tommy turned toward where he knew Diane was standing. "Diane," he called. She came forward. "I'm here, sweetheart. I couldn't have done this without you. Yes, you could have. The talent was always yours, but you're the one who taught me to use it." Tommy reached out, found her hand, squeezed it tight. "Thank you. For everything. For seeing me when nobody else did." Diane pulled him into a hug, not caring that people were watching. Not caring about anything except this incredible child who'd taught her as much as she'd taught him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding me why music matters." The reporter from the paper published a story the next week. Blind 10-year-old gives performance of a lifetime. The article included a photo of Tommy at the piano, his face serene and focused. The story went viral. Local news picked it up. Then regional news. Within a week, Tommy Berkshire was getting interview requests from national media. Richard fielded the calls, carefully protective of his son, but also aware that this exposure could open doors. The teacher in Seattle called, offering to take Tommy on as a student. A music school for the blind in Boston reached out about their program. But the most important call came from the Philadelphia Orchestra. They were planning a concert featuring young prodigies, and they wanted Tommy to perform. "What do you think?" Richard asked his son. "It's a lot of pressure." Tommy didn't hesitate. "I want to do it." 3 months after the recital, Richard made changes. He cut back his hours at work, delegating more to his managers. He started having dinner with Tommy every night. They talked about music, about school, about everything they'd never discussed before. Diane came back to work at the Berkshire house, but her role had changed. She wasn't just the housekeeper anymore. She was family. She had dinner with Richard and Tommy. She helped Tommy prepare for his lessons with the Seattle teacher. She'd become the bridge between father and son, helping them learn to communicate after years of silence. And the piano, that beautiful Steinway that had sat silent for 3 years, was finally being played the way it deserved. Tommy practiced 4 hours a day, now his skills growing exponentially under proper instruction. But every Sunday afternoon, Diane still sat with Tommy at the piano. Not for formal lessons, but for the joy of making music together. Those were the sessions Tommy loved most, when it was just the two of them playing for the pleasure of it. One Sunday, as they finished a piece, Tommy turned to Diane. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up Berkeley?" "I mean," Diane thought about the 18-year-old girl she'd been, the dreams she'd abandoned, the life she'd never lived. Then she thought about Tommy, about the gift she'd helped him discover, about the way music had healed 3 broken people. "No," she said, and meant it. "I don't regret it. Because if I'd gone to Berkeley, I never would have met you, and teaching you Tommy has been the greatest privilege of my life." Tommy smiled. "Will you play something with me? That duet we worked on last month?" Of course. They positioned their hands on the keyboard, Diane taking the lower register, Tommy the upper. Then they began to play their music, intertwining, creating something more beautiful together than either could create alone. In the doorway, Richard stood watching. He'd come downstairs for coffee and found them here lost in music, completely at peace. He thought about Catherine, about how she would have loved this moment, how she would have been so proud of Tommy, so grateful to Diane, so happy to see music filling their home again. Richard pulled out his phone, took a photo. Tommy and Diane at the piano, their hands moving in perfect synchronization, their faces reflecting pure joy. This, Richard thought, is what family looks like. Not just blood, but the people who see you, who help you, who stand by you even when it costs them everything. He sent the photo to his sister with a caption, "We're going to be okay." 6 months after the recital, Tommy performed with the Philadelphia Orchestra. He played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto. Number 2, one of the most demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. He was 12 years old. Richard and Diane sat in the audience watching this child they both loved command the stage like he'd been born to it. The orchestra supported him, followed his lead, matched his passion. When the final notes died away, the audience erupted. Standing ovation, flowers thrown onto the stage, tears and shouting and pure unbridled joy. Tommy stood bowed, his face glowing. Then he gestured to the wings of the stage, beckoning someone forward. Diane looked confused. "Is he pointing at us?" An usher appeared beside her. "Miss Williams, the young man would like you to join him on stage." Diane's eyes went wide. "What? No, I couldn't go," Richard said, grinning. "He wants to share this with you." So Diane walked down the aisle, climbed the steps to the stage, and stood beside Tommy as he addressed the crowd. "This music wouldn't exist without my teacher," Tommy said into the microphone, his voice steady despite the thousands of people watching. "Diane Williams taught me to play when I was 10 years old. She risked everything to give me music, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor that gift." The crowd applauded again, harder this time. Diane stood frozen, overwhelmed, unable to process the moment. Tommy found her hand, squeezed it, just like he used to do during their secret lessons in the Berkshire living room. "Thank you," he whispered, quiet enough that only she could hear, "for saving my life." Diane squeezed back, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving mine." Later that night, back at the hotel, Richard, Diane, and Tommy sat together in the suite's living room. Tommy was exhausted, but exhilarated, reliving every moment of the performance. "The orchestra conductor said I could audition for their youth program," he said, "if I moved to Philadelphia." Richard and Diane exchanged glances. They'd known this was coming, knew that Tommy's talent would eventually take him away from Portland, from home, from them. "Is that what you want?" Richard asked. Tommy was quiet for a moment. "I think so. But I'm scared. Of what? Of leaving you guys. Of being alone again." Diane moved to sit beside him on the couch. "Tommy, you'll never be alone." "Not really. Music connects people across any distance. And your father and I will visit all the time. Besides," Richard added, "it's not like you're going tomorrow. We have time to figure this out, to make sure you're ready." Tommy nodded, reassured. Then he yawned, his exhaustion catching up with him. "Bed," Diane said, standing. "Big day tomorrow." After Tommy went to his room, Richard and Diane sat in comfortable silence. "We did good," Diane said quietly. "Didn't we?" "You did good," Richard corrected. "I almost destroyed everything. But you didn't. You learned. You changed. That's what matters." Richard looked at this woman who'd entered his life as an employee and become so much more. "Diane, I need to ask you something. What when Tommy moves to Philadelphia, would you consider moving there too? Not as our housekeeper, as family, as the person who understands him better than anyone?" Diane's eyes filled with tears. "Richard, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Tommy needs you. I need you. You're part of this family now, whether you like it or not." Diane laughed through her tears. "I like it just fine." They sat together watching the city lights outside the window, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. A forbidden piano. A blind child's dream. A housekeeper's courage. A father's transformation. And music. Always music. Healing wounds, building bridges, creating beauty in the spaces where only silence used to live. "You know what Catherine used to say?" Richard said suddenly. "What music is love made audible." He smiled, remembering. "I didn't understand it then, but watching Tommy play tonight, I finally got it. Every note he played was love. For music, for us, for life itself. She was a wise woman." Yes, she was. Richard stood stretched. "I should get some sleep. But Diane, thank you. For everything. For seeing what I couldn't. For being brave when I was afraid. For loving my son." "It was easy," Diane said simply. "He made it easy." As Richard headed to his room, he paused. "One more thing. Tomorrow I'm calling a lawyer. I want to set up a trust fund for you, for everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed. Richard, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. You gave up your dreams for your family 25 years ago. Let me give something back." Before Diane could protest, Richard disappeared into his bedroom. Diane sat alone in the quiet suite, thinking about the girl she used to be. The one who'd set aside her scholarship to Berkeley. The one who'd thought her music was over forever. That girl couldn't have imagined this moment. Couldn't have known that loss would eventually lead to something even more meaningful than what she'd given up. Because teaching Tommy hadn't just been about music. It had been about redemption. About second chances. About finding purpose in unexpected places. Diane had sacrificed her dream of being a concert pianist. But in return, she'd helped create one. And that she realized was more than enough. It was everything.